What if I told you that a house could drive a family to the brink of insanity in just 28 days? What if I told you this house still stands today and people still live in it? This is the story of 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville. A house so evil, it became America's most famous haunted home. I'm about to take you inside one of the most documented cases of paranormal terror in history. The Amityville Horror isn't just another ghost story. It's a nightmare that began with mass murder and ended with a family fleeing in absolute terror. November 13th, 1974. 6 people brutally murdered in their beds. December 1975. A new family moves in, unaware they're about to experience 28 days of pure hell. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the supernatural. Let me paint you a picture of what happened that night in November 1974. Ronald DeFeo Jr., everyone called him Butch, was 23 years old, living with his parents and 4 siblings in this beautiful Dutch colonial house on Ocean Avenue. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. But inside, there was rage, there was violence, and there was something much, much darker brewing. On the night of November 13th, at approximately 3:15 a.m., Butch DeFeo took a .35 caliber rifle and went room to room. His father, Ronald Sr., shot in the back while sleeping. His mother, Louise, same fate. Then his brothers, Mark, 12 years old, John, 9 years old. Finally, his sister Allison, just 13. But here's where it gets strange, and I mean really strange. All 6 victims were found lying face down in their beds. None of them had defensive wounds. There was no sign of a struggle. How does someone kill 6 people in a house without anyone waking up? Without anyone running? Without anyone screaming? The police were baffled. The neighbors heard nothing. It was as if the entire family had been paralyzed by fear, or something else entirely. Butch's story kept changing. First, he claimed he wasn't home. Then he said the mob did it. Finally, he confessed. But his explanation was even more terrifying than the crime itself. He said he heard voices commanding him to kill. He said the house made him do it. Now, you might think that's just a desperate man trying to avoid the death penalty. But what happened next? What happened when the Lutz family moved in 13 months later? That's when this story becomes something else entirely. December 18th, 1975. George and Kathy Lutz thought they'd found their dream home. A 6-bedroom house right on the water, selling for $80,000, which in today's money would be about $400,000. The reason for the low price? Well, 6 people had been murdered there just over a year ago. But George and Kathy weren't superstitious. They had 3 kids: Daniel, 9, Christopher, 7, and Melissa, 5. They needed the space, and they got a great deal. What could go wrong? Everything. From day one, and I mean literally day one, things started happening. George Lutz was a practical man, a surveyor, not someone given to flights of fancy. But on their very first night, he woke up at exactly 3:15 a.m. Remember that time? That's when the DeFeo murders happened. And for the next 27 nights, George would wake up at that exact same time, every single night. But that was just the beginning. Kathy started having nightmares, vivid, horrifying dreams about the murders. She would see the killings happening as if she were there, watching helplessly. She'd wake up screaming, but here's the thing. She didn't know the details of how the family died. The police reports weren't public. Yet in her dreams, she saw everything exactly as it happened. The temperature in the house would drop suddenly, without warning. They'd be sitting in the living room, comfortable and warm, and suddenly it would be so cold they could see their breath. But only in certain rooms, only at certain times. And the smells. Oh, the smells were the worst part. Kathy would be cleaning the house, and suddenly she'd be hit with the overwhelming stench of human waste and rotting flesh. It would be so strong, so nauseating, that she'd have to run outside. But when George would come to check, he'd smell nothing at all. The children started changing too. Little Melissa began talking to an imaginary friend named Jody. Now, imaginary friends are normal for kids that age, right? Except Melissa described Jody as a pig with red eyes that lived in her closet. She'd have long conversations with this thing, and when her parents tried to listen in, they'd hear only Melissa's voice, but they'd hear responses. Whispers, growls, sounds that no 5-year-old could make. One day, George found Melissa at her bedroom window, talking to someone outside. When he looked, he saw hoof prints in the snow. Cloven hoof prints, leading from the tree line to directly under her window. But it wasn't just the kids. The house was doing things to George and Kathy too. George, remember, was a practical man, logical, rational, but he became obsessed with the boathouse. He'd spend hours down there, just staring at the water. And when Kathy would call for him, he wouldn't respond. It was like he was in a trance. When he'd finally come back to the house, he couldn't remember what he'd been doing or how long he'd been gone. And his personality was changing. This gentle father and husband became short-tempered, violent even. He'd fly into rages over nothing. The family dog, Harry, would cower whenever George entered a room. Speaking of Harry, animals know things we don't they? From the moment they moved in, Harry refused to go into certain parts of the house. He'd stand at the threshold of the formal dining room and bark. Not playful barking. This was fear. Pure, primal terror. His hackles would rise, he'd bare his teeth, and he'd back away slowly, never taking his eyes off something in that room. One night, they found Harry hanging from his leash in the basement. The leash was tied in a noose around a beam. There was no way Harry could have done that to himself. No way. By the second week, things weren't just strange anymore. They were becoming dangerous. Doors would slam shut with such force that the frames would crack. Windows would open by themselves in the middle of winter, letting in freezing air. And when they'd go to close them, the windows would slam shut on their fingers. Kathy woke up one morning with unexplained marks on her body. Scratches in sets of 3, running down her back and arms. Deep scratches that had bled during the night. George hadn't done it. He was as horrified as she was. And the scratches, they spelled something. Letters, words that made no sense. Or maybe they made too much sense. The basement became a focal point of the terror. George had been doing some maintenance work down there when he noticed something odd about one of the walls. It sounded hollow, when he tapped it. So he broke through and found a small room that wasn't on any of the house blueprints. This room, this hidden room, was painted entirely in red. Floor, walls, ceiling, all red, and it stank. That same smell Kathy had been experiencing throughout the house, but concentrated, overwhelming. In the center of the room was a drain. George called the local authorities to ask about it. Turns out, that room had been used by the previous owner, the father of the DeFeo family, for butchering. He'd hung deer, pigs, other animals in that room and bled them out. But the authorities also told him something else, something that made his blood run cold. That room was directly below the DeFeo parents' bedroom, where they'd been murdered. And according to the coroner's report, both parents had bled significantly before dying. Their blood had seeped through the floorboards into that red room below. But the absolute worst was yet to come. On January 8th, 1976, their 21st night in the house, Kathy woke up, levitating. I know how that sounds. I know. But George swears to this day that he woke up and his wife was floating 2 feet above their bed. Her nightgown was billowing around her as if she were underwater, and her hair was moving like there was a wind in the room. But there was no wind. The windows were closed. The air was still, and she was laughing. Not her laugh. This was something else, something deeper, older. George said it sounded like multiple voices laughing in harmony, if you can call that sound harmonious. He reached for her, and the moment his hand touched her ankle, she dropped, straight down onto the bed, and she had no memory of any of it. The next morning, they found their front door ripped off its hinges. Not open, not broken, ripped off. A solid oak door, thick as a phone book, with 3 heavy-duty hinges, completely torn away from the frame. The hinges were still screwed to the door, but the screws had been pulled straight out of the wooden frame, leaving splintered holes. And there were no tools around, no evidence that anyone had been there. The door was lying in their front yard, 20 feet from the house. That's when George called Father Ray Pecoraro. Father Pecoraro was a local Catholic priest who had agreed to bless the house when they first moved in. But when he'd arrived for that initial blessing, something had happened that he'd never spoken about publicly until years later. He'd entered the house, begun the blessing in the living room, and immediately felt what he described as a malevolent presence. The temperature dropped so suddenly that he could see his breath. And then he heard it, a voice, clear as day, telling him to get out. Father Pecoraro left immediately. He told the Lutzes he'd finish the blessing later, but he never came back. Not until George called him in desperation on January 8th. When George described what had been happening, Father Pecoraro didn't seem surprised. He told George that in his 20 years as a priest, he'd never encountered anything like what he'd felt in that house. He said the house didn't just contain evil, it was evil. The very structure, the land itself, was corrupted. He told them to leave immediately. Don't pack, he said. Don't take anything with you. Just go. Now, January 14th, 1976. Their 28th and final night in the house. The Lutzes had decided to leave. They'd had enough. But they needed one more night to pack their essential belongings. One more night. That was almost one night too many. Around midnight, they were awakened by what sounded like a marching band playing in their living room. Loud, discordant music that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. George ran downstairs to investigate, and the music stopped the moment his foot hit the bottom step. But the living room had been destroyed. Furniture was overturned. The piano had been moved to the center of the room. Family photos were torn from the walls and scattered across the floor. But here's what really got to George. All the family photos had the eyes scratched out. Every single one. Even photos they just put up days before. Kathy came downstairs, and that's when they both saw it. Writing on the walls, fresh writing, still wet, as if someone had just finished. But it wasn't written in paint or marker. It was written in blood. The message was simple: kill them all. But the handwriting was identical to what they'd seen in Butch DeFeo's confession letters. Letters that had never been made public. Letters they'd never seen. That's when they heard Melissa screaming upstairs. They ran to her room and found her standing on her bed, pointing at the window. Outside, pressed against the glass, was a face. Not human. This thing had red eyes, a snout like a pig, and when it saw them looking, it smiled. It smiled with teeth that were too sharp, too many, arranged in rows like a shark's. George grabbed a baseball bat and ran outside, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the snow, no sign that anything had been at the window. Except, when he looked back at the house, he could see handprints on the glass. Handprints from the inside. They gathered the children and ran. No packing, no planning. They got in their car at 2:30 a.m. and drove straight to Kathy's mother's house 3 hours away. They left everything behind. Furniture, clothes, toys, memories, everything. And they never went back. Later, when they sent movers to collect their belongings, the movers reported strange incidents. Tools would disappear and reappear in different rooms. Boxes they just packed would be found empty. One mover claimed he was pushed down the stairs by invisible hands. Most of the movers quit before the job was finished. The Lutzes lost everything they'd left in that house. The Lutz family story should have ended there. But word got out. George had told a few people about their experiences, and somehow the story reached a writer named Jay Anson. Anson was fascinated. He interviewed the family for hours, recorded their testimonies, and in 1977, he published The Amityville Horror, A True Story. The book became a phenomenon, but it also made the Lutzes targets. Skeptics came out of the woodwork, accusing them of making up the story for money and fame. The pressure was enormous. The family eventually divorced. George and Kathy couldn't handle the scrutiny, the constant questions, the people calling them liars. But here's what the skeptics couldn't explain away. The police reports, the witness testimonies, the photographs. Investigators who visited the house after the Lutzes left documented temperature anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, and photographic evidence of unexplained phenomena. Ed and Lorraine Warren, famous paranormal investigators, declared it one of the most haunted locations they'd ever encountered. And the house kept claiming victims. The next family to move in lasted 6 weeks. The family after that made it 3 months before the wife had a nervous breakdown. It wasn't until the late 1980s that a family managed to live there for more than a year. But even they reported strange incidents. Cold spots, unexplained noises, the feeling of being watched. Today, the house still stands at 112 Ocean Avenue. The address has been changed to discourage curiosity seekers, but locals know which house it is. It's been sold multiple times, usually at below market prices. The current owners claim they've never experienced anything unusual. But neighbors report that lights turn on and off in the empty house at night. Dog walkers cross the street rather than pass in front of the property. And every year, on November 13th, the anniversary of the murders, people report seeing figures in the windows. So what really happened at 112 Ocean Avenue? Was it an elaborate hoax designed to make money off a tragic murder case? Was it mass hysteria, a family so traumatized by living in a murder house that they convinced themselves they were experiencing supernatural events? Or was it exactly what the Lutz family claimed? 28 days of authentic supernatural terror that drove them from their home and changed their lives forever. The truth is, we may never know for certain. But I'll leave you with this thought. Why would a family give up everything they owned, destroy their reputation, subject themselves to decades of scrutiny and ridicule for a lie? What could they possibly have gained that would be worth losing so much? The Amityville Horror remains one of the most documented, most investigated, and most controversial paranormal cases in American history. Whether you believe it or not, well, that's up to you. But maybe, just maybe, the next time you're looking for a new house, you'll pay a little more attention to its history. Because some houses remember everything that happened within their walls. And some houses never let go. What do you think? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that will keep you up at night. Sweet dreams.